thank you very much for having me back. Really excited to be here to talk about the findings of the visitor centre study. Also feeling pretty special. I think I've been promoted from the graveyard shift on day 3 to just after lunch on day 1. I've now got a film crew follow me around, so it's kind of cool. I even got Mum to iron my shirt. We've got a fair bit to get through in 45 minutes, so we will get cracking, so I hope you've all had a good lunch. This easy to remember model is kind of the report at a glance. We had one report. We've got 6 main audiences from the report. So you've got visitor centre managers, the Visitor Centre Association, we've got the Shire, we've got Tourism Council of WA, we've got Tourism WA, and we've got the rest of the government. Okay, the saddest number of all, from my point of view, was 0. I went looking for a silver bullet that would solve all the problems, but alas, didn't find one. And that's important to remember because in writing the report, a report like this for 6 different audiences, we kind of had to cover the whole ground. So some of the things that we cover in the report talk about the network as a whole, and some of the things are more relevant to individual visitor centres. So it's really up to each of those audiences to kind of pick out of the report what's most relevant from them. And that's, I guess, what Darren's chat is going to be about later on. What's Tourism WA's take on what we found, but it's something that each of you will need to go through. The process that we followed, I won't spend too much on this. We looked into some best practice and consumer trends. We didn't do any primary research with visitors because it's been done a lot in other jurisdictions, and we wanted to make the most of the scope of work. We then went out and spoke to, I think the end number was 82 different visitor centres around WA. So there were 4 of us that worked on that. We also talked to other stakeholders, so the Shire and other government people involved in visitor centres. We then had lots of fun pulling it all together, and the result of all that is, I guess, today's presentation. We had 7 different lenses for analysis that we used. So the first one was looking at the understanding of the purpose and the role of visitor centres. The second one was the current performance of visitor centres, looking at the network as a whole in terms of governance and accreditation, looking at branding, funding and resourcing, location, and then broader trends in terms of visitor servicing and technology. We looked at both domestic and international research, and the common theme across all of them was very, very clear. Every time they asked visitors what they want out of a visitor centre, it's to provide visitors with insights into the region and distribute information about tourist product. So that's, if you like, the core business, and it's really important as we look at anything else we do to create value that we don't move too far away from that and we don't actually impact negatively on that. We then had a look and we asked people what roles they're currently playing, and we found that there was quite a variance there. So finding number 2, luckily 100% of the visitor centres we spoke to actually provide information. So that's a big tick. We're kind of doing what people want from that respect. But beyond that, there's quite a range of different activities. So about 50% take bookings, about 40% focus on the community in terms of providing information back to the local community, what's on calendars and things like that. Some basic destination marketing. Again, about 30% look at that in terms of local holiday planners. Some, about 25%, do more advanced destination marketing, actual formal campaigns and things like that. And about 20% focus on industry linkage and do a lot of work in terms of industry engagement and trying to build the capability and product development locally. There's also quite a variance in the roles that people think you should be playing. So that's a really key element to try and get some common ground in terms of what roles should different visitor centres be playing. Okay. So, implications. 1, we need to get the role right and have people understanding what the role of visitor centres need to be. And implication number 2, in terms of the strategy, we cannot stretch so far away from the core that we're actually endangering it. We did get feedback as we went through that some visitor centres, or some visitors have been to centres where they felt that there was a disconnect between what they expected to find and the way that they were treated in terms of being overly salesy. They didn't feel that they were getting the experience that they wanted. When we started off, there were lots of kind of hypotheses around, and these have been repeated in other studies, and one of them was that the overall performance of visitor centres, visitation had been shrinking, and that this was because of the internet and technology, and it was basically going to kill off visitor centres altogether. So we set out to look into that. We had a hard time sort of proving it. When we looked at different visitor centres, each of you are experiencing different things. Some visitation is growing, some doesn't change that much, and others has been shrinking somewhat. When we looked at the NVS stats, that shows a very small increase. So it became very clear that there's no kind of one easy way to measure it, and that this current thinking, there's a lot of sort of misconceptions about what the actual performance of visitor centres really is. We also found that the people who go to visitor centres are really valuable. So they spend on average per visit to WA more than double that of non-users of visitor centres. And again, they stay more than twice the time. So 14 days average stay versus 6, over $1,700 average spend versus $774. That's not causative. They don't sort of walk into a visitor centre on day 6 and suddenly decide to stay another sort of 10 days. But it does show that it's a really important engagement channel with people who are staying quite a long time and spending money in WA. The real benefit of visitor centres sits outside the profit and loss. We talked about this last time, but other jurisdictions in Australia have measured the impact of a trip to a visitor centre, and it's between $56 and $107 per visitor, regardless of whether they actually buy anything in the visitor centre or not. So what that's saying is your impact on the local community is not always properly reflected by your P&L. Unfortunately, it's not saying that if you kind of do this visitor centre field of dreams and get Kevin Costner to manage it, that people are suddenly going to come. You actually do need some visitors in the region, and you do need some product. But it really does show that we're probably not looking at visitor centre performance in a holistic enough way. And when we talked to stakeholders, it was pretty clear that most of them don't really take this approach in terms of how you're performing. So that's a really important slide. That quote there came from a visitor centre manager. One of the first people in line each year with his membership check is the local mechanic, because he understands the amount of business he gets from our referrals. So again, that sort of points to the broader impact that a visitor centre can have in the local community, because most stakeholders will not see a mechanic as a tourism business, but that business certainly did. Now, when we looked at kind of performance, a lot of people had different views, and visitation itself is a little bit of a clumsy metric. It's a little bit like revenue, because if your revenue goes down by 10%, you might think, well, that's a bad result. But if the market has actually gone down by 50%, then it's a very good result. So it doesn't give you the perspective that you need. So we had a look at this idea of a regional visitor penetration. So we looked at each visitor centre's visitation stats, where we were given them, and we expressed that as a percentage of the total visitation to that region, because that's the most accurate sort of numbers that we can get. So that's showing that if it's not your job to bring people to the region, but we sort of thought, well, maybe it's your job to give them a reason to visit you once they're in the region, because that's potentially within the remit. The RTOs, it's their job to bring people to the region. You can bring people to your visitor centre once they're there. We found there's a huge range of performance across the different visitor centres. So for some, we're penetrating 0.01% of total visitors to the region, and up the upper ends in Australia's Coral Coast, there's a visitor centre doing 27%. So that shows me a couple of things. One is that we're probably not leveraging best practices as best as we could in terms of ways to get people into visitor centres. The other one is that there's upside. We can actually increase the value that we're creating through the visitor centres by getting more people through it. So there's plenty of room to move based on those stats. In terms of a benchmark, although it's not directly comparable, the best stat that I've seen is for New Zealand, where 40% of international visitors there go to at least one eyesite. So that just sort of gives you an idea in terms of where there could be upside here. So I think it's got potential as a metric that we can use to benchmark across different visitor centres that's actually related to what you can control. So implications there, if we're going to have meaningful discussions with stakeholders and get people actually engaging with the future visitor centres, and particularly when we're talking about this question of sustainability, we need some common measurements that actually mean something. So that's a big thing. We also need to not borrow from other jurisdictions' stats on terms of the value that visitor centres can contribute. We actually need to be having a look at what the actual numbers are in WA. All right, governance and accreditation. It quickly became apparent to us that there really isn't a network, it's more a collection of individual centres. That is in part shown by the number of different models that there are. There's 28 tourism associations, there's 39 local governments in terms of management models, there are 11 CRCs, and there are 5 that are actually private of the 81 that we had a look at. Above those, there's also no real management model. You've got the Visitor Centre Association of WA, but that sits sort of right at the top and isn't really structured or funded to play a day-to-day management role in terms of bringing different visitor centres together. You've got RTOs that have an MOU in terms of supporting visitor centres, but really their main focus is on leveraging industry funding to try and get people to visit the regions. What this means is we're kind of missing out on leverage opportunities. So unfortunately, one visitor centre plus one visitor centre is normally equaling 2, or in some cases 1.75. And that's leveraging in terms of cost efficiencies and also marketing efficiencies. We're not working together as smartly as we should be, which is a massive issue given that we know that the one thing we've got the least of is resources. So we need to be sharing and working together a lot better than we are. The last one is that there's not a lot of performance management that goes on. There are people with strategic plans, but when we had a look at it, there's not a lot of accountability. There's sort of moderate at best in terms of, did you do what you say you were going to do? And again, I think it points back to that. If we don't have a measure for performance that's real and meaningful, then it's actually very hard to manage within that system. Is there any indication that a more integrated network might have some benefits? Well, the eyesight one that I mentioned before is one of them. As I said, 40% of, or over 40% of international visitors go to an eyesight, and their customer satisfaction levels, because they're able to create a more consistent customer experience, are over 90%. We're not advocating we suddenly move to this massively central model, but we do think that there's some benefit in looking at ways to create a lot more integration and cohesion amongst visitor centres. We also got a lot of feedback that the accreditation model lacks relevance. One of the quotes was, yeah, they come in and check whether our cleaning products are up to scratch, and that it's not focused on the visitor experience, which is where the focus of the visitor centres are, is on trying to create that quality customer experience. So again, there seemed to be a little bit of a disconnect there. So one of the things that we took out of that realisation that we've got lots and lots of different models being managed in lots and lots of different ways is that if we came up with a recommendation to have one prescriptive model that said you need one big visitor centre and 6 small ones per region or something like that, that it absolutely wouldn't work, that the transition from all of those different current scenarios into this new one, it would fall down and do that very, very quickly. So we needed to come up with something that's a little bit more flexible and could be built from the ground up by trying to take into consideration all of those different starting points. We also saw that a network that is managed more than it is now could actually have a greater impact. All right, branding is pretty inconsistent, and that iBrand, we didn't feel that it really stood for very much. The first indication that we got from that, when we went to visit all the visitor centres, a lot of the stuff we did was sort of road trips in the car. The entry statements as you're going into any of the towns in terms of letting you know there's a visitor centre there to start off with and letting you know where it is are not great. Even within town, signage isn't great. So that's an issue. The look and feel on the outside and the inside, again, is very, very different. Now, I know a lot of you don't have any control over the venue that you've got because that's an arrangement with the Shire, but there's still not a lot of consistency between the different visitor centres. I'm not picking on you, Nick, but that's a picture of Broome and the signage pointing to the Broome Visitor Centre. And this is a picture from Melbourne where you've got the traditional tourism brown, much larger, and saying that that's where the Federation Square Visitor Centre is. So that was quite a marked comparison that we saw there. it's important because people don't always associate the benefits that they should with the yellow eyes. Some research was done in Victoria in 2000, and it asked whether people saw that there was a difference between the old blue and white sort of Times New Roman eye and this italic eye. 80% of them didn't know what the difference was. So it's not promising something to people, and it should, because we put a lot of work into wearing it. Funding and resourcing. Ooh. This is an ugly chart. This is a projection of an average visitor centre that shows the impact of the growth in costs based on the average costs that we've got and the growth in revenue. And what it factors in is a shrinking in online booking revenue because of much greater competition. We're even seeing at the top end that people are consolidating in online booking, and it's a battle that we're not set up to win. So it's all based on assumptions, of course, but in this example, it points to a $50,000 funding gap in the 5th year. So the financial sustainability challenge is then twofold. We need to look at ways to, oops, nearly pointed to the slides. We need to look at ways to increase those revenue numbers and create more value and bring that red line down in terms of looking at funding efficiency. And because of that, that leverage and working together becomes even more important, because that's one way to do that. Okay. We had a look, the CRC review was going on at the same time as we were doing this project, and when we spoke to a few people, they were worried about the idea of co-locating with a CRC because they felt that they weren't very tourism focused. One of the findings of the CRC report was that CRCs need to be focused on demonstrable economic outcomes, and tourism fit very neatly into that sort of new focus. Whereas before, I think they were seeing themselves as a provider of a suite of services. This is saying, no, you need to be looking at what really contributes back to the community. So then for some visitor centres in some locations, it potentially looms as a better fit than it did before. The next one is that staffing and that provision of quality information is a major issue. Again, won't be any news to you. Well, actually, you were the guys that told us that, so it shouldn't be. But look, working with volunteers, training people on different systems and that ability to create a uniform customer experience, particularly when you've got sort of dips and troughs in visitation, is a real challenge. And if we go back to the original expectation of visitors that they do get a high quality user experience, that this one's really, really critical. Then we thought, okay, we're seeing all this stuff, we're seeing that it's sort of not managed, there's lots of variance. So we know that funding is an issue, and everybody, the people that fund you and yourselves, it's something that you look at all the time. We know that the definition of what is good performance and the role is there's a lot of different views on that, a lot of different management models, and there's this lack of overarching management layer. We thought maybe, just maybe, by some kind of lucky accident, we've kind of got it right. Maybe that the funding that visitor centres are getting is somehow kind of matched to the opportunity that's out there. So it was hopeful, but we thought, okay, we'll have a look at it. Nah, the answer's no, unfortunately. What we've got, this is a level of opportunity. So what we've got there is, we looked at two things there. We said, what's high opportunity? It's where you've got quite a bit of visitation and quite a lot of available tourism product to promote. We thought that that was the kind of place where you could be delivering upwards of that $107 mark in terms of each visitor. Then we had a look at the level of government funding in terms of the averages of what we've been shown there. There were 35 visitor centres that gave us all of the data that we needed to sort of plot this. And what you would want to see is a sort of a straight line going up that way. To that side of the line, sort of above the line, is where the funding levels are actually over and above the level of available opportunity. So you can see there's some there with quite high funding, but perhaps not the surrounding opportunity to make a return on that investment. We've also got quite a few down in the lower matrix where they've potentially got a lot of opportunity to add value to the community. They've got high visitation and a lot of surrounding tourism product, but their funding is commensurately much lower than other ones. So again, it just pointed to that fact that we're not necessarily all talking the same language and seeing the opportunities for visitor centres in the same way, and that's driving some disconnects in terms of the way funding's being allocated. So, takeouts from that. The sustainability is a two-pronged challenge. One is creating more value, and two is being more efficient with funding. And with that funding efficiency, we're not set up for that at the moment. It's really hard as a small organisation to be efficient with very much at all, because you're flat out just covering all of the bases, and we're not playing that game very smart. The last one, that matrix in terms of opportunity and funding provides a framework to actually have some meaningful discussions with our stakeholders, and perhaps some new ones that we haven't been able to have before. All right, location. It's really important. And a lot of the locations, when you combine that with signage that isn't great, then you've kind of got more chances of finding Wally in this picture. And I've spent a lot of time looking at this picture and I still can't find him. Does it make a difference? Yeah, it does. There's anecdotal evidence from WA actually of a visitor centre that moved from the back streets onto the main street and doubled visitation. If you combine that with signage, so if we go to the next one, this is the Truckee California Welcome Centre near Lake Tahoe. They actually didn't move, they just got their signage right. So they put these countdown signs on the freeway, and again, without doing anything else, they doubled their visitation. So these simple things are really, really important, and again, we're not getting them right. So it needs to be part of every visitor centre strategy, and it needs to be part of shareholder and stakeholder thinking in terms of what that strategy needs to be. All right, we'll have a look at some of the trends in visitor servicing. I think sometimes they're sort of used interchangeably, but the way that visitors are now, pre-destination and post, visitor centres are just part of the picture. Even in destination, they're using accommodation providers, they're using travel agents, they're even still engaging with electronic direct marketing. The other thing that's changed a lot is that sharing of your holiday experience used to happen after you had had it. It starts right at the dreaming stage now. People on bloody Facebook putting countdowns to their next holiday when you're not going on it is not good. But that's the level of engagement that's happening now, and social media is creating that. There have been some amazingly successful campaigns with Instagram just by getting people to engage with their destinations and share things like that. So we have to see our role in all of this as part of a broader picture. Okay, next one. Oh, that's nice and small for you up the back there. All right. This is a chart that was done again in Melbourne, looking at the source of information that visitors use. There's a couple of really interesting things here. 4 out of the top 5 are not technology. So number 1 at 68% is tourist brochures. Second at 63 are digital maps, websites and apps. 55, street signage. There's that S word again. 54, accommodation staff. Then printed maps of Melbourne. So they're the sort of top 5. Visitors information centres, just under half of the people in CBD use them there. So again, we're part of a much broader picture, but we don't always think in those terms, in terms of thinking of how we can provide information to people. The other thing there that it kind of relates back to the New York example, the case study that we had a look at, where they've got a budget as a visitor centre of about $5 million or something ridiculous. They choose to spend that not on apps, but by getting better maps of New York, actual paper maps of New York. That's where their focus is. Okay, the impact of technology. Again, this kind of, is it going to kill visitor centres off? We looked at the data and we found no linkage. Part of that was because there's not a lot of data that we're able to equate, but other because there doesn't seem to be much relationship. We had a look then for a proxy, like where could we get some learnings from, and we thought that bank branches versus online banking could be a useful sort of example to learn from. So we had a look at it, and this bit up here is the number of bank branches over time. So on the left-hand side is 2001, on the right-hand side is 2012. Under that, we've laid over exactly the same time period the growth in internet banking. So you can see there that internet banking has skyrocketed, but the number of bank branches actually continues to grow. And when you find out, I was actually working in banking at the time, and a lot of banks said, right, the internet's going to do everything. They shut everything down. Customers hated them, they left, and then they had to open them all back again. The learning that they've had, that customers are doing about 3.5 times the number of transactions online than compared to all of our other channels. So there's a lot of transacting going on. But the number of customers visiting branches has not changed significantly. What is changing is the reason they're actually going into the branch. So the local branch actually remains a key touch point for many customers and is the place where people go for advice on their more complex needs and where they want to have a face-to-face discussion. So I felt that was quite a good parallel to what we were seeing in terms of the visitor centres. But the learning of the banks are that number of bank branches has actually grown, but the resourcing of them has changed, so there's less people in them, and they're doing it with much less footprint. So if you notice bank branches now, they've got kiosks, they've got smaller shopping centre, sort of open on Saturdays type branches. The big mega branch, there's much fewer of those. So they've adapted and looked at the way they need to change resources and physical presence, but not actually their footprint. They've got the same number, in fact, more branches than they did before. So we felt that that's kind of new thinking, but it's perhaps a learning for us in terms of, we know that we've got resource constraints. We need to be getting smarter about the way that we're achieving similar results based on what we know people actually want out of their visit to a visitor centre. Some other innovations that we observed, mobile apps. It is a good fit with mobile apps and visitor information. They want maps, they want restaurants nearby. It's easily digestible through a mobile app. And we know that the number of people travelling with mobiles, particularly in the key markets visiting WA, is growing. Other people have looked at it in terms of more immersive centre environments. So one of the things that we noticed when we had a look at the different visitor centre layouts was a lot of it is brochure heavy, and it's kind of like walking into a library. It's almost confronting the amount of information that you're being asked to present. What we've seen in overseas and in some of the case studies we had a look at, people are trying to clear that away to make it more focused on the visitor. They've still got the information, it's just behind the counter. So it clears away different spaces for people to come in, have a chat, and then they can walk out with the brochure. Whereas at the moment, it's kind of like, it's a lot of in-your-face information. Other people are using touch screens and sort of the kind of puck technology that was used in Manchester, where you can interact with different areas of the city, twist the puck to see what accommodation options are there and things like that. So that's it's almost giving people a reason to go to the visitor centre beyond the actual provision of information. It's the experience that they're providing. Some have used mobile visitor centres, so it's a way to follow the crowds and actually take information to people, and particularly where you don't have a great location. That's one way to overcome that. Near-field communication is a technology that's been around for a little bit. It's not available on the iPhones yet, but they're looking at it for iPhone 6. And it's basically a way for someone with a smartphone to receive information over a distance of about 2 metres from a very cheap and simple sort of transponder. Lends itself to brilliant walk-around tours where you can sort of carry your phone. When you reach a certain spot, the information will be fed to your phone. Museums are using it to real success in Europe, and it basically means that you can look at sort of selling even guided tours without having to have all the capital equipment, the risk of getting it stolen and things like that. Others have looked at ambassador programs. So not all of these are technology innovations, but we wanted to put them up there to kind of get people thinking. Ambassador programs are where you use nearby businesses to support your endeavours as a visitor centre. So you kind of train them up as mini ambassadors of the region. It gets you around long opening hours, the cost of staff, and it gives you a little bit more flexibility in terms of the provision of information. The other one that we saw was sort of shops in shops. So one example was in New York, where I think it's Bloomingdale's. There's a New York City Visitor Centre actually in Bloomingdale's. It's about 1/3 of the size of the other visitor centre. It does a lot of ticket sales, but while they've got people there, they also provide a lot of information. So it's a way of getting to more visitors, increasing those visitor penetration numbers. There's also some revenue opportunities that are available there. competition for online bookings is growing steadily. That's not a battle we are set up to win. We haven't got the platform, we haven't got the marketing spend. The user experience online is pretty clumsy. It's not something we're going to continue to be able to build and base a long-term revenue sort of outlook from. It does have its place, don't get me wrong, especially where a lot of the product that you've got available is not big enough for any of the aggregators. But in terms of looking to grow that significantly into the future, to me, I don't think it's going to be the answer. We also looked at different visitor centres, sort of online and digital strategy. So we mapped out kind of the leaders who are doing very comprehensive, regularly updated websites and have got quite a high social media usage. So Kalgoorlie's a really good example there. Most of the visitor centres kind of sit in the middle, and then there are some that sort of lag behind. It's not really surprising when you consider the range of funding and resources available. But again, visitors to WA and visitors wanting to engage with the destination, they don't know any of that. So again, it's a big disparity between the best online presence and the worst. The one thing that was really clear is that, again, we're all trying to do it ourselves, and we're trying to do it within our own visitor centre rather than perhaps looking at ways to leverage across a number of different visitor centres and try and get a better presence that way. So takeouts there. We really need to think resourcing, footprint, and the way we're delivering information in terms of how we go forward and become more sustainable. And we need to look at ways to generate greater innovation in technology. And that's not me saying, okay, off you go, just innovate and find more money magically to spend it. We've got to be smarter about the way that we're approaching innovation and trying to share that load. So, 8 recommendations in the report. Most of these are at the network level. Number 1, we recommended a statewide communication of the study and the findings. Visitor centres and stakeholders. This report, as I said before, there's different bits in it for different audiences. It's actually really difficult. It was lots of fun to write, I can tell you, but it's really difficult. You have to make sense of it in terms of a local context because everybody's situation is so different. So it's really important, and that's one of the reasons Mr. Film Crew over there is here, is that it enables people who aren't here, but also stakeholders, to understand the findings from the report. Because we're all talking slightly different languages, because we don't have, I think last year I asked how many people actually had a visitation strategy, and I think 2 people put their hand up. We're not approaching strategy development and measurement of performance in the same way. So the second recommendation is a standardised approach to that. We think that the current accreditation program needs to be reviewed. There's evidence that in New Zealand they've got a very strong visitor experience focused accreditation program, and we think that it should be reviewed to make sure it's not being overly cleaning products. We need to get that figure for what visitor centres in WA are producing. It's a great number what we've found, but it's still a bit easy to write off as, oh, that doesn't fly here. It's not a WA number. If we had something for WA, even in a couple of different jurisdictions, we think that would really help to get people seeing things the same way. We need modular training across the network to, again, focus on that visitor experience. And take into account the different types of employees and volunteers that we've got across the network. We called this a sub-regional management layer, but we wanted to try and find ways in different regions to bridge that gap across visitor centres and look for a role that could be looking for leverage different sort of funding efficiencies, looking for, if knowing that this visitor centre over here is looking at an app and saying, well, why don't you talk to these people because they're looking at the same thing, instead of both people spending $5,000 and getting a moderately good app, if they both put their money together, they might spend $8,000 and get a much better app that works for both. That's not happening at the moment, but everybody's busy. You don't have time to actually pick up the phone and build some of those bridges. So that management layer we saw as something that could help that. The way we saw it was it's kind of a ground up thing, and it's for different regions to have a look at potentially repurposing an existing role. We're not trying to build huge layers of new roles and try and find homes for them in some central body. We actually think that this is something that could be tackled on a regional basis. More work done on a stronger I brand, so getting some consistency around signage and, or street signage and presentation, both in and out. We also found that the entry statements in airports, there's no visitor centre presence in either airport, and we think that's an issue. That's a major throughput for people. We're not introducing the idea of visitor centres. So A, we make them hard to find, but B, we don't give people a reason to look for them, and that's something we need to address. Lastly, and it's in some ways linked to the management layer, is looking at ways to not let everyone try and build their own technology platform. It's just not going to happen. We need to be looking at ways to create some shared technology platforms, but also the support and the training. It's no good having the platform there if your staff aren't trained to use it. So they were the 8 recommendations in the report. So that's not saying that you can take away and go, right, well, we're going to redo the brand, but that's something for the other stakeholders to consider. So this is sort of my take to you guys. If I was going to sit down with you sort of one-on-one, this is the sort of stuff that I would be talking about. It's really a challenge in 3 parts that you've got. So the first part, that blue bar there, is the amount of money that you're given from your local government on average. The grey arrow, the bit above that, is the money that you earn through memberships, through retail. We need to look at growing that, and we need to look at decreasing that horrible red line, which is the amount of money we spend on costs. And so it's a challenge in 3 parts. Challenge 1, it's changing the conversation is the first step, and some of the information that's in the report can help you to do that. The first thing is to agree the role you can be playing. There's lots of different views on what visitor centres should and shouldn't be doing. You have to be speaking off the same page for it to work. The second bit is to understand the benefits that you are delivering, but also that you could be delivering, and get some agreement about that. And the third one is agree a single measure of success. There's no good seeing the investment that local government makes in visitor centres as kind of a sunk cost. We need to be showing the return that's coming off of that, otherwise you've got nothing to work with. It also makes it a lot harder when local government changes, you get a new council on board, you almost have to re-win the right to get that money. That's really hard work. You haven't got time to do that. So we need to start establishing a common view of visitor centres. Challenges 2 and 3 depend on the kind of visitor centre that you are. So we sort of thought that we can use this sort of funding versus opportunity matrix to start to group different visitor centres into segments. So, and it's really telling you the kind of strategic focus that you should have. So down here, where you've kind of got low levels of opportunity and low funding, your focus really needs to be on being as efficient as possible with that funding that you've got. So that's saying get that information out there, but at the lowest cost possible. If you're in that kind of mid-ground, and this is where a lot of you guys in this room will sit, it's about optimising your model and being really conscious about the cost of trying to generate extra value and looking for new ways to be efficient with it. At the higher end, you can be looking at more value creation. So it's really a top-line focus as to different ways to create more value. So for funding efficiency, in terms of value creation, it's trying not to recreate the wheel each time, looking at standardised information provision so that anybody can do it, any business that's around town, and putting as much information as possible onto apps that are already in existence. Don't be trying to build anything else. This is a way to create a bit more value here. Cost focus in terms of reducing your location costs, and a lot of the ones that sit in that segment actually are already co-located. They're the types of visitor centres for which that network of small business ambassadors really helps to be able to shrink your opening hours. And potentially some of them don't need to be there. You could actually rationalise with other visitor centres and look at more of a sort of a hub and spoke model where you've got bigger ones and smaller ones in the region. So those are some of the sort of strategic questions to consider for those kinds of visitor centres. For model optimisation, in terms of value, it can be like partnerships with larger surrounding centres to look at actually sharing and driving visitation between the centres. That dumb stuff, signage, get getting that right and spending some money on getting that right, getting more people into the centre and more chances to achieve revenue. We saw some examples of providing telephone and admin support to local industry on a fee-for-service basis, focusing on that visitor experience to create more value that way. Some people with larger centres have looked at subletting or short-term rental of space for events and functions. It's really starting to have a different view as to the assets that you've got to work with. In terms of cost, it's having a look at what the cost benefit is of things that you've always seen as value creating. If online bookings continue to shrink, well then you kind of have to have a look at, well, okay, it costs us money to support industry, to upload things to there. It costs us money to have the service each year. There might become a point where it's actually not worth having it, and some visitor centres have actually made that call. You might just want to say that it's taking us a lot of staff to provide all these value-add activities. Maybe we just should be information only. So it's starting to think like the banks do and say, well, what model actually needs to work here? Again, downsizing and outsourcing some of yours to a larger hub and becoming a spoke within that hub. Co-location with attractions. Most of the visitor centres of this size are sort of too large for co-location with a CRC, but it makes sense to do it with an attraction because you can drive more visitation that way. The volunteer ambassadors are another example here. But also regional leverage of costs. So fixed costs that are the same for different visitor centres, so printing or your website costs, think about consolidating those and seeing if you can leverage them by sharing them. Okay, in terms of value creation, the strategic focus here is about extending value, but not at the expense of the core. So in terms of creating value, you can look at owning local events. Signage upgrade still needs to happen here. You can actually act as an outsourced print or marketing service to other local businesses. Again, fee for service and sublet or short-term rentals. Some of the cost savings there are looking again at helping out some of the smaller ones, looking at, there's still co-location with key attractions, that's still a valid strategy there, and becoming a centralised sort of regional operations hub. So taking on all of the smaller visitor centres around you and taking on a lot of their operations, again for a share of the costs, but you may find that the total cost is a lot less than what it's currently costing across each of the centres. Thank you very much.